The Douglas A-20 Havoc attack bomber represents an advanced pre-war design that proved effective in combat in World War II. Modifications kept the A-20 viable well into the war. The A-20 was a sporty design with a narrow fuselage wide enough for a single pilot cockpit. The crew was either 2 or 3 depending on variant. R2600 engines mated to Hamilton standard 3-bladed propellers gave the A-20 a top speed well over 300 miles an hour. In some scenarios, A-20s made minimum altitude ground attacks with hit-and-run dash capabilities. In the South Pacific, General Kenny's 5th Air Force embraced the use of small parachute bombs he had devised many years before the war. A-20s and other bombers dropped these bombs from low altitude over parked enemy aircraft, the parachutes slowing their fall while the A-20s escaped their blast. If A-20s sometimes flew unescorted at minimum altitude, at other times efforts were made to provide fighter cover as well as disruption of enemy airfields in an effort to protect the attack bombers. The intensity of anti-aircraft fire over continental Europe in 1944 and 45 saw A-20s and other bombers prosecute the war from higher altitudes than treetop level. 3 Air Force A-20 groups flew their Havocs in the Pacific theater after peace in Europe had been achieved. Air Force records show A-20s still in the fight in late June 1945. But the end of the line was clear. Douglas's later A-26 Invader was the new bomber of choice, and by war's end, A-20s were quickly retired. Some A-20s contributed to flight test research. In April 1942, an A-20 with internal liquid-fuel JATO assemblies in the nacelles pioneered the exploration of assisted takeoffs. Later, an A-20 with outer wings removed tested tire friction and skidding at Wright Field. Another test used tracked landing gear to spread the load over unprepared surfaces. Glenn Edwards flew A-20s with the 47th Bomb Group in 1942 and 43. From combat experience in North Africa and the Mediterranean theater, Captain Edwards went on to a flight test career that ultimately cost his life in the crash of a YB-49 flying wing. Edwards Air Force Base is named in his honor. Genesis of the design that became the A-20 began with the Douglas Model 7A of 1936, strongly influenced by designer Ed Heinemann. The first user of the new warplane was France, who ordered hundreds under the designation DB-7. The DB-7 used 1,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines and featured a smaller vertical tail than subsequent A-20s. Next was the DB-7B, equivalent to the AAF's A-20, using Wright R2600 engines of 1,600 horsepower. Turbo superchargers were applied, but the A-20's operating altitude was typically too low to benefit from the turbos, so they were deleted on production aircraft. Those built with turbos were modified either as P-70 night fighters or F-3 photo aircraft, both of which could benefit from the high-altitude capabilities of turbo superchargers. The A-20A of 1939 and 1940 eliminated the complexity and weight of turbos and was the first bomber variant in mass production for the Army Air Forces. The A model was also designed with a quirky defensive armament, the placement of a .30 caliber machine gun aimed to the rear from each long engine nacelle. The 999 production model A-20Bs for the Army Air Forces were about 5 inches longer than adjacent models due to changes in the nose glazing. The lone XA-20B, converted from an A model, tested power dorsal and ventral turrets as did the XA-20F. To facilitate overseas orders for the Douglas DB-7B attack bomber, Boeing contracted in May 1940 to build them in Seattle. 240 of the Boeing production represented a French order taken over by England after the fall of France in 1940. These were delivered in Royal Air Force markings between October 1941 and March 1942. Boeing production continued with 140 Army Air Force's A-20Cs, built to British Boston 3 standards. Some went to the RAF and others flew with the Army Air Forces. By now, the basic production rationale and style were set for the A-20. Crew consisted of one pilot in a narrow cockpit, with a bombardier in the glazed nose ahead of the pilot and a gunner in the fuselage just behind the wing. With Douglas's El Segundo plant running at capacity, Douglas opened a new assembly facility at Long Beach, California, for increased A-20 production. The logistics of efficient aircraft production caused another shakeup in A-20 work, with all future construction shifted to the company's Santa Monica plant. All A-20s, starting with the Douglas-built C models, came from Santa Monica. The C model, which deleted the nacelle machine guns, represented an effort to standardize production for the Army Air Forces and Great Britain. Ultimately, the A-20 series came to be known as the Havoc in the Army Air Forces, this name coined by the British for their fighter and intruder versions. The first American unit to fly combat with A-20s was the 15th Bombardment Squadron, which arrived in England in May 1942 and entered combat over the continent on the 4th of July that year. Next production version of the Havoc for the Army Air Forces was the A-20G, representing two key changes. Gone was the plexiglass bombardier nose, replaced with an aluminum nose housing strafing armaments that varied between 50 caliber and 20 mm on some models. Then, starting with the A-20G Block 20, the aft fuselage widened by 6 inches to accommodate a Martin 250 power gun turret in an aft dorsal location. Underwing bomb racks on the G model could double the bomb load from 2,000 to 4,000 pounds. The A-20H was similar to the G model, but featured a different R2600 engine that promised a modest increase in speed. A return to bombardier noses with fewer metal ribs resulted in the A-20J based on the G model and A-20K based on the H. The last A-20 rolled out by Douglas left the plant on 20 September 1944. Douglas built 7,385 of the bombers. In addition to bomber versions, the A-20 emerged as the F-3 photo aircraft, based initially on early A-20 models. Later, some A-20Js and Ks became F-3As. Other A-20s were fitted with British radar and revised armament as P-70 night fighters for the Army Air Forces. Some saw operational duty. Other P-70s found their greatest value as trainers for P-61 Black Widow night fighter crews. The A-20 was not just an American tool of the war. The British flew them in combat, as did the French. The British made modifications to some of their Bostons or Havocs in an effort to exploit all the aircraft they could. The Soviets used several thousand of them, sometimes prosecuting the war from extreme low altitudes. A few A-20s survived, and several museums around the world display Havocs. Here are some examples as of the production date of this video.